Hey Sugar Snaps, welcome to the Textile Indie YouTube channel. If you're new here, my name is Brittany. Welcome in, I'm glad to have you. If you're an old friend, welcome back. In today's video, I'm going to talk about t-shirt yarn. I have 5 tips on how to use it effectively, as well as go over my crocheted poof crochet pattern and walk through how to complete that and make this lovely poof project. So check the description below for the link to the written out pattern. I'll be referencing that, and I will note that the details in the written pattern are going to be the most up to date. So be sure to check the written pattern and follow along with that. I reference X number of rows because I'm referencing that written pattern. So while this tutorial doesn't have every single step laid out, the written pattern does, and you can follow along with that with my tutorial. Now let's dive in and talk about materials. For today's project, I'm using Ganchet's fabric yarn or t-shirt yarn. I have this charcoal color, a tan color, and this terracotta kind of burgundy. What color would this be? Dark terracotta. Ganchet has a lot of different great fabric yarn colors, and by fabric yarn I mean t-shirt yarn. To find the Ganchet yarn, use the link in the description below. They have a lot of great colors to choose from. And you can also use this coupon code to get a percentage off of your first purchase. I wanted to share 5 tips that I have for working with t-shirt yarn to ensure that you enjoy the process and that your projects turn out the way that you intend them to. Tip number 1, use the right crochet hook size. Depending on the yarn that you're using, whether you have bought the fabric yarn or you made your own t-shirt yarn, the width of that material is going to be different. So do a test run with your crochet hook to make sure that you have the right size. You want it to work easily through the fabric because the t-shirt yarn is already going to be somewhat challenging to work with, so you want something that's the correct size so that you're not fighting it, you're not snagging it if it's too big, or causing problems trying to fight the gauge if it's too small. Tip number 2, when you're crocheting with fabric yarn, especially t-shirt yarn, don't stretch your yarn as you work. It can be easy to be crocheting along and stretch your material as you do your crochet stitches, and I would say try really hard to avoid this because what happens is you end up with distorted stitches and you end up with a higher tension in your piece, and it will not relax or ease up the way that yarns typically would with blocking or any finishing techniques. The fabric stretched out is going to stay really rock solid and it won't relax at all. So try not to stretch it when you're doing your crocheting. Tip number 3 is to work supported, and that is because this yarn is very heavy. And as you're making your projects are going to get very heavy. That might mean your project's resting on a table while you crochet. It might mean you're sitting in a chair with arms so that your elbows are supported and you can work in your lap. Depending on how you like to typically crochet and the size of your t-shirt yarn project, you may need more or less support to hold that up. Tip number 4 is to work with your whole arm. Crocheting is often a quick wrist movement. You work mostly with your wrist, and that's one way to keep your speed up. However, when you work with the t-shirt yarn or fabric yarn in general, you're going to be working with a lot more weight, and it's good to use your whole arm rather than relying on just your wrist, which will get worn out rather quickly with this heavyweight material. Use your whole arm to do your stitches. Tip number 5 is kind of a two-parter. Think simple and small, or home decor. And what I mean by that is that if you're making something from t-shirt or fabric yarn and you want to crochet it with a lot of texture, you are going to end up with something that's gigantuan and that's super bulky. If you use textured stitches like a bubble stitch, you're going to end up with huge bubble stitches. So back it up, use some more simple stitches, and try to simplify the texture of the material to highlight the material itself. The second part of this tip is to think small when you're planning your projects. If you want a large tote bag, t-shirt yarn is going to make that tote bag super heavy. So if you add anything to that tote bag, you're barely going to be able to lift it because this is a heavy material. So use it for things that are a little bit smaller or that are home decor pieces like bath mats or organization baskets or poofs, things that you can use that have a little bit more density. Maybe the weight will benefit them, and you can display your work in a way that you don't have to schlep around and go to the gym just in order to pick up your bag. To start my poof, I'm going to begin with this gray color, and I'm going to start with a slip knot. So I'll set up this slip knot, and I want the tail end to be the tightening end because I'm going to use this as a magic ring setup to get started. So I'll slip my crochet hook into that piece, allowing the slip knot to sit right on top. I'm going to catch a loop, bring it through. Try not to tighten up too much because I don't want to stretch out this yarn. Yarn over and pull through this loop to create kind of a chain. And then I'm going to single crochet into the ring 8 times. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then I'm going to take my tail and pull on that tail to tighten the loop up. This is that magic ring. It'll tighten closed. Space my stitches out and catch that first chain that I did, this loop right here, with my hook. I'm going to join the loop by pulling through in a slip stitch. So here is my beginning ring for my poof. Now to build this poof, I'm going to be working in half double crochet, and I'll show you how to do that in a minute. But before we start, I'm going to be starting and finishing each row, joining them together. So when I start a row, I need to chain 2. So this is the start of my next row. And I'm going to be crocheting through both the front and the back loops of the previous row. So when I yarn over for a double crochet, I send my crochet hook through both loops of this chain. I'm going to yarn over, pull a loop through. So now I have 3 loops on my crochet hook. I'm going to yarn over and pull through all 3. That's a half double crochet. Now I'm going to do that a second time in this same stitch. Yarn over, send my hook through that same stitch, yarn over, pull a loop up, yarn over and pull through all 3 loops on the hook. Now we're going to shift to the next stitch, yarn over, send my hook through both the front and the back loops. These get treated as one now. Yarn over, pull a loop through. So I have 3 loops here. Yarn over and pull this loop all the way through all 3 loops. So now the pattern here is going to be stitch 2 half double crochets in a stitch, and then stitch 1 half double crochet in the following stitch, and then stitch 2 in the next stitch. So we're alternating 2 half double crochets, 1 half double crochet per stitch. So do that all the way around. You'll finish off with 2 half double crochets in that last stitch, and then the chain 2 that we started out with will be in between our last 2 half double crochets in the space and our first 2 half double crochets over here. From here on, when you go to do the joint with the beginning chain that you started this row with, you're going to send your hook into this space. So my chain 2 is right here. I'm going to go into this space between the chain 2 and my first stitch of the row. Yarn over, pull that loop through, and then pull that loop that I just pulled up through the loop that was originally on my hook. So now I've joined that row and I've gone through the whole chain rather than just one loop. This will add more stability to that row, so there's not as much of a space here. And because these rows are going to get bigger and bigger, I like to close that up so it's a little more secure. We're going to repeat this 2 half double crochets in a stitch, alternating with 1 half double crochet in a stitch for X number of rows. You can find all the information on that in the corresponding pattern. You can find the link in the description below. When you've completed X number of rows, you're going to now start crocheting, continuing in half double crochet, but just doing 1 stitch per previous stitch. So rather than alternating 2 and then 1 stitch per previous stitch, we're just doing 1 stitch per stitch. With that row complete, now I'm going to switch colors to this terracotta color, and this fabric yarn is a little bit lighter than my slate gray here, so I'm going to double up and use 2 strands. So what I'm going to do is take an end, give myself a tail, loop this over the hook, and I'm going to use this to start my chain 2. And then I'll give myself a tail of the gray about 10 or 12 inches long, leave that in there. And now I'm going to crochet 1 stitch per stitch like we did until I've gone all the way around. I took an old sheet and I split it in half. It was a fitted sheet, so it had elastic in it. I split it down the middle. I took half of the sheet, laid it into my poof, and then stuffed that with the fiber fill. Folded the edges over to kind of cover the fiber fill, and then took the second half and put the elastic side, tucked it into the edges and kind of covered the fiber fill so that the fiber fill is encased in that fabric without me having to sew a special case for it. So it's all encapsulated within my poof in that recycled material, and so it's nice and fluffy, has some nice bounce, but it's not going to come popping out of the sides of my stitches. So if you're trying that technique, try to find a fitted sheet that's a color that's going to look nice popping through your crocheted poof. Once you've come up with a stuffing situation that's large enough for your piece, you can remove it and set it aside. You'll be placing this back in your poof once we've closed the opening up enough that it will fit. We will continue to work decrease rows until this side is high enough that we can stuff it. With 2 rows of terracotta complete, I'm going to cut this, leave myself a tail, and move back to my original color, which is this slate gray. Going to attach this by chaining 2. Tie these 2 ends together inside. Nice and snug. And then I will continue with another decrease row with the slate and then put in my form. Okay, now with this smaller opening, I'm going to stuff in my form. And to do that, I'm going to take my crochet hook and give myself a nice long loop so that if it gets pulled, it won't undo too much. If you're working with a nice new pillow form or a round cushion form, this is going to be a fairly simple process to fill this in. I'm using the recycled sheet and a recycled pillow combination, so it's going to be a little bit more tricky to get this in here. Okay, once your form is in, you're ready to continue working your decrease rows. When you've done X amount of rows on the decrease, you're now going to transition to crochet in a stitch, skip a stitch, crochet in a stitch. And then finish the whole off with single crochet in every other stitch. cut a nice long tail. Send this yarn through the loop and pull tight, and then tuck your tail into the poof, and you can weave it in or just simply tuck it into the poof like so. Give your poof a little bit of a pat down to kind of shape it into the form that you want. Well, after completing my poof, I am very happy with it. The colors came together really well, and I think it's going to look nice in the studio. It is very heavy. So as I mentioned in the 5 tips on working with t-shirt yarn, just keep that in mind. The result of your project will be quite heavy, and there's just a lot of material involved in making a t-shirt yarn project. Well, Sugar Snaps, thanks so much for joining me in this video. I hope you try a project in t-shirt or fabric yarn, and be sure to check the description below for the links to the ganchette materials that I used in this project, as well as the Revolution Fibers crochet hooks. You can find lots of resources down there. Thanks for joining me. Happy making. See you next time.